prophecy in the miracles. A prophetic revelation from the feeding of the multitudes to the transfiguration of Jesus. A prophetic portrait about and for the end times, written in the events, miracles, signs, and wonders as a living parable from the feeding of the multitudes, walking on the sea, and through to the transfiguration. Another way of saying this is a pattern or typology that is enacted to portray a prophecy, as the Jewish feasts are also enactments that give prophetic information and revelation. This begins with John the Baptist being beheaded. Because John the Baptist had said to Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have her," and although he wanted to put him to death, he feared the multitude because they counted him as a prophet. This is from Matthew 14, verses 4 through 5. Even though John was preaching baptism and repentance as a prophet to make straight the way of the Lord and preparing the people for the Messiah, he also addressed issues of transgression of the law. John is imprisoned for speaking out against Herod and Herodias. He ends up beheaded for it because of lawlessness and ungodly depravity. A prophetic picture begins to emerge when Jesus gets news of John's beheading. Then John's disciples came and took away the body and buried it, and went and told Jesus, from Matthew 14, verse 12. Verse 13, when Jesus heard it, he departed from there by boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the multitudes heard it, they followed him on foot from the cities, and when Jesus went out, he saw a great multitude, and he was moved with compassion for them, and healed their sick, and because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. Mark 6:34. When it was evening, his disciples came to him, saying, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is already late. Send the multitudes away, that they may go into the villages and buy themselves food." But Jesus said to them, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." Jesus withdraws to a deserted place away by himself, probably to mourn and pray. This news would be painful and troubling to him. This was no doubt a sign to him that his time left was short, and it was time to prepare his disciples for that. They would all find themselves in a deserted place without him soon. Jesus' compassion for the multitudes goes deeper than their immediate situation. The disciples' first words and observation are prophetic and accurate. This is a deserted place, and the hour is already late. This is the first hint that this scene applies to latter times when the place is deserted and the hour is late. Deserted being without the Lord being with them physically. Jesus, knowing he would not be with them much longer, as they were like sheep not having a shepherd, so he began to teach them. He begins to shift the work of the ministry to them, to feed the multitudes who seek and follow after him, and to give them the bread of life. Also, this is among the last things he says to the disciples before departing into the clouds after his resurrection. He said to them, "Feed my lambs," and "Feed my sheep." John 21:15 and 17. A living parable. It's helpful at this point to note that Jesus fed the multitudes 2 times. The first in Matthew 14, verse 13, and the second time is placed nearby at Matthew 15, verse 32, where they begin at those verses. Both of these events are then summarized by Jesus to his disciples, reminding them of the main points and numbers involved in those miracles at Matthew 16, verses 9 through 10. This creates a structure for this parable, reinforcing important points. That and the content of the events throughout this portion of Scripture are the basis for indicating a larger cohesive structure carefully orchestrated and meaningfully assembled. I'm going to switch over here to this graphic that I created just to help picture this. Here's a parenthesis, and I'm talking about these inner parentheses first, from Jesus feeding the miracles, feeding the multitudes, miracles, then walking on water, then Jesus' summary of feeding the multitudes, which I gave the verse just then. So This is a structure so that we know where this structure ends and begins, and that we can look at the events in here as having a special meaning because they fit together, and there's a begin point and an end point, kind of a parenthesis type of statements that put brackets around them. Then there's a larger one where from the beginning of John the Baptist being beheaded, which is why I began there, which, and I will get into this, represents Jesus' death, through to right after the transfiguration of Jesus, they're having a discussion of John the Baptist. They ask him about Elijah, and Jesus says that he was John the Baptist. So that is the end point of this larger structure. So this is just a graphic representation of what I'm trying to say to help visualize it a little bit better. So it's not hard to believe that Jesus and the events surrounding him play out a message and a larger living parable as he is the Word made flesh. Moreover, in this part of the Gospels, he is indeed teaching that he is the bread of life, which is the Word of God. From the execution of John the Baptist and then through to a specific point at the end of this narrative structure, a living parable plays out that represents the period and events from the death of Jesus to the glorious appearing at his second coming. The final point at the end of the narrative is where Jesus and the few disciples with him are coming back down from the mountain after the transfiguration, and they ask him about Elijah. Then the disciples understood that he spoke to them of John the Baptist. That's in Matthew 17, verse 13. This is the second bracket or bookend of the larger allegory and the match to the beginning of John's execution. It's an amazing adventure with a prophetic revelation. It doesn't just prove he knew the end from the beginning. It tells us what to expect and where and how we fit into it. God speaks from heaven both literally at the transfiguration and figuratively through the events and life of Jesus through this section in this parable. The feeding of the 5,000. The miracle of feeding the 5,000 is the only one that is included in all four gospel accounts, so its significance can't be overstated. Also, it's one of two very similar miracles, including the feeding of the 4,000 found in Matthew and Mark. While both are important and fit together, this is the more important one, especially due to the events that immediately follow and what they signify or symbolize. It bears repeating that this is a deserted place and the hour is already late. The day was far now spent, from Mark, verse 35. And that Jesus says to his disciples, you give them something to eat. If we accept that John's execution represents Jesus' death in this parable, which I get into building a case for why that is, with the details later in the scripture, I'll get to that. Then his disciples must act in his place in the physical, with him guiding and providing, and it fits perfectly into the rest of this allegory. While there are clues in this miracle, and all of the details confirm this view and more, it's the overall picture that reveals what's going on here, with the details in the narrative of this and subsequent events that confirm and clarify with nothing to indicate otherwise across all of the gospel accounts. And this is consistent, and it has to be consistent across all scripture for this to work, for it to actually be an allegory depicting something or having a prophetic narrative. The death of prophets is linked with the death of the Messiah in scripture, as in the parable of the wicked vine dressers. Now, when the vintage time drew near, he sent his servants to the vine dressers, that they might receive its fruit. And the vine dressers took his servants, beat one, killed one, and stoned another. Again he sent other servants, more than the first, and they did likewise to them. Then last of all he sent his son to them, saying, they will respect my son. But they took him and cast him out of the vineyard and killed him. Matthew 21:34-39. And this obviously, this last part, symbolizes what happened to Jesus when God sent him. And they said to him, we have here, his disciples said to him, we have here only 5 loaves and 2 fish. He said, bring them here to me. Then he commanded the multitudes to sit down on the grass. And he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke and gave the loaves to the disciples, and the disciples gave to the multitudes. Matthew 14, verses 17 through 19. So he has the multitudes sit down, and he blesses the loaves and fish and broke and then gave the loaves to the disciples, who give to the multitude. This is a distinct picture of the bread going out from Jesus to the disciples and then to the multitude in a specific pattern and flow that Jesus orchestrates by commanding them to sit down. And according to Luke 9:14, the pattern is even more specific and orchestrated into groups of 50. In all of the accounts, the loaves and fish continue to be divided and passed out. Through this division, it is multiplied. From verse 33 in John 6, 33 through 35, for the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Then they said to him, Lord, give us this bread always. And Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. John 6, 33 through 35. And John 6:51, I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I shall give is my flesh, which I shall give for the life of the world. It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Matthew 4:4. And Jesus is quoting Deuteronomy 8:3 in that verse. These verses establish that this bread is the bread of eternal life, and not about feeding the masses in the physical, but about distributing the word of God and ministering to the multitude, as the lives of those in Christ do as living testimonies. Clearly, you are an epistle of Christ, written by the Spirit of the living God on tablets of flesh, that is, of the heart, 2 Corinthians 3:3. It can be divided without dwindling and feed throughout the ages. And yet the spiritual does manifest in the physical. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things, food, clothing, that we need, will be added to you. Matthew 6:33. The fish represents his flesh as well. So they all ate and were filled, and they took up 12 baskets full of fragments that remained. Now those who had eaten were about 5,000 men, besides women and children, from Matthew 14, verses 20 and 21. The very particular and specific pattern of the multitude sitting down in groups of 50 has a definite purpose and meaning. Also, there are about 5,000 men, besides women and children. It is amazing that there are 7 items of food in groups of 50. These are the 2 numbers in Jewish culture, especially when used together for marking years of time. Every 7th year is a Sabbath year. 7 weeks of years are Jubilee cycle, and every 50th year is a Jubilee year. And so, as the hour is already late, and the day is now far spent, as in Mark 6:35, the multitudes represent years of men. The women and children underscores and adds generationally to this meaning, that the 5,000 years of men are multiplied as generations through a period of time. Also, they sat down in ranks, in hundreds and fifties from Mark 6:40, ranks and hundreds also signify the multiplying of these time periods. The bread of life is distributed and time flows to and past men, just like the pattern in this miracle. The other accounts state about 4,000 and about 5,000 for these miracles, and Jesus uses these numbers specifically when reminding the disciples and referring back to them. That is in Matthew 16, verses 9 through 10. There are not 12,000 or 20,000, either implied or otherwise, in these accounts, as some commentaries assert, and the miracle doesn't seem to have the need for excessively increasing these numbers. It's reasonable to believe that in that culture and time period it would be mostly men out there and far fewer women and children. The feeding of the multitudes happens in similar fashion 2 times, the feeding of the 4,000s and of the 5,000s. They represent 2 millennial periods, the 4,000s and the 5,000s of the 7,000-year plan for mankind, of which the 6,000s, or the 7th millennium, is the millennial reign of Christ on earth, from Revelation 20, verses 1 through 6. Christ's second coming is around the end of the 5000s or the beginning of the 6000s before the millennial reign. Suffice it to say that any other numbers in this miracle used here would invalidate this entire meaning or this perspective or view or interpretation. The days of man are numbered in the eyes of God, and in this living parable, this is just demonstrated rather precisely and definitively. So I'm going to go back to my graphic illustration here, just so we don't have to think about this too hard. We can see it. From the time of Adam, which would be year 1, you have the 100s, then year 1000, then the 1000s, 2000s, 3000s. Jesus comes and he was crucified in 32 AD, around the year from Adam of 3976. The year of 4000, the year count of 4000 would be around 56 AD. So from this point back is BC on our calendar, and from this point forward is AD or CE, which stands for Common Era. So the 4000s and the 5000s would be, from Jesus and God's point of view, the way they number time and each millennium. And the 6000s would be the millennial reign period, with 7000 being the final end point of God's time frame for in history for man. Now this is the years from Adam. I'm not saying from creation. It may be from creation. I'm not even making that point. I'm saying the genealogical time frame from Adam, and it's been calculated multiple times by multiple people. And just in general, I'm picking the number of 3944 BC, which is kind of a consensus midpoint time frame from multiple calculations. Without getting into that any further, that particular number is not important for this discussion, just to give kind of a visual reference for how this time frame works out, which then puts us, and I get into this at the end, I summarize it at the end, but since I'm going over it, puts us at 5960, and the year 2016 corresponds to 5960. And after 7,000, see, this is the second coming right here around 6,000 sometime. I'm not trying to be specific with this whole discussion. This isn't about time frames. This visual reference isn't about time frames to set a time frame or to try to be specific, any more specific than we already know as far as times and seasons and the signs of those, that Jesus says, know when you see these things, all these things, that the time is near. So I'm not getting any more specific than that. This is a visual representation of 4,000s and 5,000s, ending at 6,000, which begins the millennial reign, which ends at 7,000. Satan is chained here. The second coming happens. Christ returns. The millennial reign happens here. This is the final judgment, according to end-time theologists and Revelation, especially chapter 20. And eternity begins after the final judgment with the new heaven and the earth and the new Jerusalem. So there we are. Those are just factual, historic numbers, and it fits into the numbers used in this view of these parables, which I'm going to add here that I did research and I couldn't find anyone who had done a commentary or that explained these numbers or give them meanings. But what I did find are a lot of commentaries where they could not identify what these numbers meant. So I'm surprised that no one had seen it this way before or come up with these numbers. So that's why I keep saying, if any of these numbers don't fit, then this whole view doesn't work, because it has to all fit together for this view to be valid. I'm not trying to create something that isn't there. I'm trying to reveal what I see that is there, but only reveal what is there. So at the end of feeding the 5,000, which is the end of the 5,000s, or the 6th millennium, in the allegorical view, we would expect some interesting events to take place representative of the end times, because it corresponds to the second coming of Jesus, including Christ coming in his kingdom. There should be some insights into the actual coming of events depending on what is depicted for us to examine. If so, it confirms a prophetic allegory for us and a revelation. If not, it all falls apart, if it just doesn't work in any way. They took up 12 baskets full of fragments that remained. Just continuing with from Matthew chapter 14 in verse 20. And John is the only one who records this next gem pertaining to this miracle specifically. So when they are filled, he said to his disciples, gather up the fragments that remain, so that nothing is lost. John 16:12. Gathering up the fragments so that nothing is lost doesn't just symbolize the abundance and overflow of the bread of life God provides to all there who came to seek him, but that he makes provision for others who are not there. And the 12 baskets would be for the 12 tribes of Israel during the tribulation as far as the timing in the larger parable. Of those whom you gave me, I have lost none, from John 18:9. The remnant from the 12 tribes of Israel are sealed before the trumpet judgments begin. That's in Revelation 7, verses 1 through 8. They minister the truth in the Word of God during the final 7 years and tribulation of judgment. Jesus returns to the disciples. From Matthew 14, verse 22, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now when evening came, he was alone there. The multitude being sent away and sending the disciples to the other side represents the passing of time and Jesus' physical absence. This is reinforced with Jesus going up on the mountain to pray, or ascending to be with the Father physically, being with him in prayer, which can represent an ascension. When evening came, he was alone there, confirms and reinforces his separation from the world at that point. Sending his disciples to the other side in the boat across water represents a journey across time to a certain goal and endpoint, and it begins immediately after feeding the 5,000. But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now, in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them, walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer, it is I. Do not be afraid." Matthew 14, 24 through 27. The wind is now contrary, and the Lord is about to come to those in the middle of the sea, being tossed by the waves. Jesus comes to them walking on the sea, like coming in the clouds for those looking for him and waiting for him, who are waiting and watching, who are exactly where he told them to be, faithfully doing as he instructed. Those in the boat are those disciples in him, in his word and in his spirit. He comes in the fourth watch of the night, just before dawn, 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. So it would still be dark. They did not expect him to be walking on the sea to them and are afraid until he tells them to be of good cheer. It is I, or literally, I am. And you can see it as literally I am in some versions of translations. They put that in there as a literal note. We are to know that he will come for his disciples supernaturally, and not to fear because he is coming to the rescue. But it will be such a fearful and awesome sight that it will terrify those who do not know him and are not abiding in him, awaiting his return. Peter provides more important insights on this scene. Matthew 14, verses 24 through 31. This reveals that Jesus will bid those of faith to come to him at that time. He will not let those followers sink, but will be right there for them. But note carefully that those are to have faith and not doubt. The clear message from the Savior, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Matthew 14, verse 31. This faith can only be gained by walking with him and learning to put our trust in him. Then he went up into the boat to them, and the wind ceased, and they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure and marveled. That's from Mark chapter 6, verse 51. So, from the time he is with them again, the storm is calm, and this will be an amazing event when this prophecy manifests in its literal fulfillment. Then the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Therefore you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Matthew 24, verses 30 through 31, and verse 44. Then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. That's in John 6, verse 21. According to John, there's another miracle here, that after Jesus gets in the boat with them, the boat is immediately at the other side where they are going. So the miracles and the living parable continue. It indicates that those with him will then be immediately taken with him to the other side. There's something important and amazing that happens next as well. And as many as touched the hem of his garment were made perfectly well. That's from Matthew chapter 14, verse 36. This is consistent with the rapture and those raptured receiving glorified bodies made perfectly well. The actual scenes may be a little different from how the ultimate prophetic fulfillment happens, but the flow of the parable and the prophecy they depict is unmistakable. It's possible that the men gathering the sick, bringing them to Jesus, represent the angels gathering his elect to him. From 1 Corinthians 15, verse 51, Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. For this corruptible must put on incorruption, and the mortal must put on immortality. So this miracle here very well is symbolic of, and seems to reflect very clearly or very closely to the verses about the rapture and being changed, and the ones who are there on the other side where Jesus went, who touched the hem of his garment, were made perfectly well. Not healed, but perfectly well. So if there's evidence of the timing of the rapture depicted here, it's that there is some tribulation represented by the wind and rough water in the middle of the sea, but it's not a full-blown storm. So that, and being directly at the end of the 5000s with no intervening narrative, it just indicates, kind of lends itself to a pre-trib rapture type of timing. I'm just saying. I'm not advocating anything here. I'm just saying, if there's something to be learned from this revelation, it might be that. That might be another thing. In what we know between Daniel and Revelation, this fits into it really nicely, and it shows that it's a confirmation, and it gives us maybe a little more information. It's a confirmation of time frames, and it's a confirmation that we can look that to God for sustaining us and giving us prophetic insight and caring for us enough to give us even another picture of these events and what is going to happen in them. And we have to know that this is from God. It can't be orchestrated by anything. It wasn't written by man. It was acted out by Jesus and his disciples. So it's a stronger confirmation. Evidence is abundant that God is orchestrating these events, including the wind being contrary. It slows them down and keeps them in the middle of the sea, and the disciples in the boat rowing most of the night, but ending up right in the middle of the sea. Then when Jesus is with them, they are immediately at the other side to where they are going. Then he went up into the boat to them, and the wind ceased. Also, Jesus did not command the wind and the waves. They just stop when he gets in the boat, unlike the storm before in Matthew 8:26. The accounts in Matthew and Mark are similar from this point in the narrative through to the transfiguration, and they continue filling in the images of the larger picture parable. The others seem to pick up at points closer to when the transfiguration takes place. For example, John in his account gives more insight highlighting the antagonism between Jesus and the Pharisees and the rejection of him within that portion of accounts in all of John chapter 6, the period between Jesus walking on the water before the miracle of feeding the 4,000. All of the gospel accounts within this section have components of conflict, with much, if not all, of the focus on the problem of unbelief, the rejection of Jesus as the Messiah by the nation and Pharisees, and shadows a certain impending judgment suggestive of a tribulation period before the transfiguration. Just for illustration here, we are at the point just before Jesus feeds the 4,000 in the biblical narrative, which is the companion miracle to Jesus feeding the 5,000. Then the scribes and Pharisees, who were from Jerusalem, came to Jesus, saying, "Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they don't wash their hands when they eat bread." He answered and said to them, "Why do you also transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition? Hypocrites! Well did Isaiah prophesy about you, saying, 'These people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men.'" This is Matthew chapter 15, starting in verse 1 through verse 9. Before anyone rushes to judge the Pharisees, because everyone always does, we're all guilty of that. We like to do Pharisee bashing all the time. They would do well to examine their own values and theology. It seems that men still consider themselves righteous while devising endless ways to justify transgressing the commandments of God, being disobedient, and living according to their own way. The issue always comes down to having a heart for God, to walk in his ways and keep his commandments, and to be obedient and faithful, and to walk in the works that he has prepared for us. Grace does not excuse us from pursuing holiness and godliness any more than God desires sacrifice. They both cover the sin. God's desire is for a broken and contrite heart with repentance and turning from sin. This narrative in the gospel shows the type of thinking and condition of the heart that separates man from God and excludes those from the rapture, if not eternal life. Grace worse then, with Jesus calling them hypocrites. "Most assuredly I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he shall never see death." John 8:51. The Gentile woman, next in Matthew 15, verses 21 through 28, coming to Jesus, seems to underscore that the focus at this point is on the Jewish nation. But he answered and said, "I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." That's in Matthew 15, verse 24. And that it may well take great faith for those still there during this period of time in the parable to overcome. Her faith and humility exceed that of those around her, becomes an example to others, and she is given what she asks, exceeding that of those around her. Jesus ignores her until she demonstrates great faith. In most other healings and requests, even of Gentiles like the Roman centurion, they're not ignored that way. So this indicates something else is going on here. And you really have to think about it. And I'm not trying to contrive something. I'm just looking at what is there. It's a little different, and we don't want to ignore those differences. We don't want to say, oh well, there's an explanation here that actually gives a reason for why there might be a difference here. So there's something indicating something else is going on in this section, and the view of the larger parable reflecting the tribulation period at this point kind of explains that scene a little better than nothing else or nothing at all. So the feeding of the 4,000. The placement of this section is out of sequence, but it didn't really need to take place before the miracle with the 5,000 for it to effectively help complete the larger picture. It relates to the companion miracle well in its depiction, and the number of 4,000 places it in the right order easily enough. At this point, it serves to reinforce the image and complete the picture. Also, Jesus does summarize and highlight them together in Matthew 16, verses 9 through 10. Do you not understand yet, or remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000 and how many baskets you took up, nor the 7 loaves of the 4,000 and how many large baskets you took up? So, in both of these parables, many are healed first, and they all marvel and proclaim Jesus to be the Son of God. Therefore, in both cases, feeding the multitude is completely unnecessary for any further sign confirming Jesus as the Messiah. Additionally, he commanded his disciples that they should tell no one that he was Jesus the Christ in Matthew 16, verse 20. Then he commanded them that they should tell no one, but the more he commanded them, the more widely they proclaimed it. Mark 7:36. 7, verse 36. He is still asking them not to reveal it. So this doesn't fit the commentaries or assertions that Jesus kept doing more or greater miracles for more to believe. There's another reason, and the only one that keeps this entire narrative from being confusing on several levels, is that these miracles mean something else. As with feeding the 5,000, Jesus has compassion on these who have continued with him for 3 days and now have nothing to eat. And I do not want to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the way. This is Matthew chapter 15, verse 32. This phrasing is very revealing that this is about more than food. On the surface, it is so they will not faint from walking back from where they came, for some have come from afar. That's in Mark 8, verse 3. However, Jesus says time and again, this is not about physical food, but representative feeding the multitude with the bread of life, as in John 6. And what about all of the other multitudes, on all other occasions who came from a longer distance, lest they faint on the way, and who have come from afar, is in the very larger sense that there is coming a very long period of time, especially from the 4,000s, where the multitude needs to be sustained by the bread of life. Jesus doesn't just come out and say this plainly because it is not for them to know or try to understand at that point. Yet research shows the early church fathers understood and wrote about the 7 millennium time frame planned for man. But at the time, it was not clear as to at what point Jesus returns within it, or when he returns for good to set up his reigning kingdom. It's for the end times generation now to know and understand, and to know that it was planned in prophecy from the start. We are those who have come from afar, seeking the bread of life. This plan is specific, well documented, and now revealed in this living parable also. This miracle is conducted in the same fashion as feeding the 5,000 with similar wording and description. This time, 4,000 besides women and children, from Matthew 15, verse 38. So all of the corresponding analysis from that section applies to this one. Again, they are all seated, and the bread is broken and passed out from Jesus to the disciples and to the multitude. This completes the picture of feeding the multitudes over 2 millennia with the bread of life by way of his word and through his disciples. In this miracle, they collect 7 large baskets of fragments, where before it was 12. This 7 of baskets in the context of the earlier millennial period would represent the 7 churches and 7 spirits of those churches before the throne of God. And that's in Revelation chapter 1, verses 4 and 20. It talks about the 7 churches and the 7 lampstands, who are the 7 spirits before the throne, which in this time frame of the parable are the operative force. Whereas it reverts back to the 12 tribes at the end of the next period of the 5,000s. Across end times prophecy, the final 7-year period before the second coming of Christ deals primarily with the salvation of the Jewish nation, the descendants of Abraham, who are not Christian, and then with the final judgment and destruction of those rebellious and rejecting of Almighty God Creator, the one true God. Impending judgment. Starting Matthew chapter 16, verse 1, Then the Pharisees and Sadducees came, and testing him asked that he would show them a sign from heaven. He answered and said to them, When it is evening you say, It will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and threatening. Hypocrites, you know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times. A wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign shall be given to it, except the sign of Jonah the prophet. And he left them and departed. This is the sign in the larger narrative representing judgment to come. Hypocrites, you know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times. For Jesus to call them hypocrites the second time in this narrative is a judgment, a strong word, and a stern rebuke for him. This is a prelude to when Jesus goes in to this subject further in Matthew 24, chapter 24, and this is a shadow of that discourse and placed here within the parable that signifies it. In his first coming, Jesus did not come to bring judgment, but came to die as the holy, acceptable sacrifice, to pay the price for sins and the redemption of man, and then to be raised from the dead in body, as all those who accept him as their Savior also will be. Therefore, there is no scene or depiction of destruction and judgment in the parable, only allusions to it. The other substantial allusion to judgment and destruction is that which Jesus takes on himself, predicting his death and resurrection. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and be raised the third day. That's in Matthew 16, verse 21. So, obtaining that, in doing that, he obtains the legal authority to save all those who are his from judgment and destruction at his second coming. Take heed, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Mark 8:15. The disciples are reminded at this point of the specifics of both miracles of the feeding of the multitudes in Mark 8:19 through 20. 5 loaves for 5,000 with 12 baskets of fragments, and 7 loaves for 4,000 with 7 large baskets of fragments left. We need to understand and not lack faith in Christ either. This is the bookend or the end point of the section relating to these 2 milestone miracles. However, there's still the final bookend, an end point to the larger parable remaining, that began with the execution of John the Baptist, representing the death of the Messiah in the parable, and ending with Jesus referring back to John right after the transfiguration, which represents his second coming. So in the graphic, we're at the point before the healing miracles, which represent the restoration, just prior to the second coming. In other words, the miracles and events that happen at this point in the biblical narrative should only have to do with restoration or things that would happen before the second coming for the typology to hold. The restoration. There are several distinct and symbolic healings within what would be during the tribulation period in this narrative. So symbolically, during the tribulation period, there are some symbolic healings. Very distinct. One covered previously is when the daughter of the Gentile woman has the demon cast out by Jesus from where he was at. Another is in Mark 7, verses 32 to 35, where Jesus heals a deaf man with a speech impediment. He speaks the word emphatha, that is, be opened, in this account. The last is where Jesus heals a blind man in Mark 8, verses 23 through 25. In this account, there's a 2-step process. He spit on his eyes and put his hands on him. He asked him if he saw anything, and he looked up and said, I see men like trees walking. As he completes the healing in the next step, this would be for the benefit of the observers and the narrative, considering Jesus could have and always did heal completely on the first try in just one step. It would seem that he gives this man a kind of vision. Then he put his hands on his eyes again and made him look up, and he was restored and saw everyone clearly. So I'm not going to pretend to understand fully what happened here and what this vision means, but I think it is a vision. I think it means something. And I think, and maybe someone with better scriptural understanding, someone who knows more scriptural detail and more prophecy, may understand precisely what this might refer to elsewhere in Scripture and how it might be interpreted, that he says, I see men like trees walking. Overall, the Lord symbolically restores the understanding, knowing, and accurately speaking the truth back to those who are deaf, mute, and blind. This would represent God restoring the former understanding and abilities back to his chosen people who had rejected the Messiah at the first coming, who were thereafter given over to a strong delusion, and all of us, for that matter, all of us who remain. These would be the big 4 of the healings and restoration: to restore righteousness and deal with sin and casting out the demon. Satan is bound for 1,000 years in Revelation 20, verse 2, before the millennial reign. And to restore vision, understanding and speaking of the truth, where there had been confusion, blindness, and error or lies. Before the blind man's vision is fully restored, he ironically sees the reality of the situation around him, men like trees walking, or men who are spiritually deaf, mute, and blind in need of restoration. So here I offer an explanation and what that vision represents and how it fits in possibly. The transfiguration. This is picking up Matthew chapter 16, verse 24. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake," and the Gospels in Mark 8:35, will save it. For what profit is a man if he gains the whole world? Or what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For what whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him the Son of Man also will be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with holy angels. Mark 8:38. For the Son of Man will come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then he will reward each according to his works. Assuredly, I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Matthew chapter 16. Clearly, this refers to the transfiguration that happened next, for some who are standing there to be able to see it. Jesus associates it to the second coming also with his description, preceded with the qualifications for salvation in him. And when he comes back, he also, in Revelation, refers to coming with his reward, to reward each according to his works. And there are some standing here who shall not taste death is also a type of reference to a rapture. There's no mistaking that. So, beginning Matthew chapter 17, now after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, led them up high on a high mountain by themselves. Now, I'm highlighting after 6 days because that's significant, and I'm going to talk about it where it fits in more. He was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. While he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and suddenly a voice came out of the cloud, saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him." Not only do Moses and Elijah appear talking with Jesus, but God the Father is there in a cloud and gives confirmation and witness of Jesus as his Son. After 6 days indicates a relevant prophetic time frame. Within the 7 millennium plan for man, Jesus Christ will return fully glorified in his kingdom after 6 prophetic days, or 6,000 years. Scoffers ask, where is the promise of his coming? But beloved, do not forget this one thing, that with the Lord, 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day. That's 2 Peter 3, verses 4 and 8, and a reference to Psalm 90, verses 3 through 4 and verse 10. Moses appears with Jesus, and he also waited before going up to the top of the mountain before God called him into the cloud after 6 days to receive the law and 10 commandments the second time. That's in Exodus 24, verse 16. This pattern has been reflected since the book of Genesis, when God instituted the 7-day week with the 7th day rest, and since the 7-year Shemitah cycle with the rest from planting and harvesting every 7th year, including freeing indebted slaves. And as previously mentioned, the 7 weeks of years ending in the Jubilee year during the 50th year. And just to review here, here's the timeline graphic. And you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 millenniums ending at the year 6000, and the 7th millennium beginning with the year 6000 to the year 7000, which is the 7th millennium. And that is the Sabbath millennium, where righteousness will reign and the earth will rest from evil on the 7th millennium, with Christ reigning and Satan bound, which is consistent with God's commandment to remember the Sabbath, and to keep it holy. And I will reiterate that the modern dates that I've associated with this graph are just representative, they're approximate, and I am in no way attempting to set dates here because this video is not about that at all. Jesus predicted, and he did rise from the dead on the third day, after 2 days. Another reference is in Hosea 6, verse 1, "Come and let us return to the Lord, for he is torn, but he will heal us. He is stricken, but he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up, that we may live in his sight." At the time of the transfiguration and crucifixion, there were 2 prophetic days left until the second coming of Christ. In other words, back at our graphic, that the 2 days are as 2,000 years, with a day as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as a day with the Lord from previous mentioned scripture. So that would be from the 4,000s to the 5,000s, and then the 6,000, which fits nicely. The 2,000 years or 2 days fits nicely at the end of the full 6,000 year overall time period, which happens to coincide with the Lord returning at the end of those 2 periods. As they came down from the mountain, Jesus commanded them, saying, "Tell the vision to no one until the Son of Man has risen from the dead." And his disciples asked him, saying, "Why then do the scribes say that Elijah must come first?" Jesus answered and said to them, "Indeed, Elijah is coming first and will restore all things. But I say to you that Elijah has come already, and they did not know him, but did to him whatever they wished. Likewise, the Son of Man is also about to suffer at their hands." Then the disciples understood that he spoke to them of John the Baptist. So, some perspective verses that fit into this. God, who does great and unsearchable things, wonders without number. That's in Job chapter 8, verses 8 and 9. And also from Job chapter 31, verse 4. "Does he not see my ways and number all my steps? But concerning the times and the seasons, brethren, you have no need that I should write to you. For you yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. But you, brethren, are not in the darkness, so that this day should overtake you as a thief. You are all sons of light and sons of day. You are not of the night, nor of darkness." Paul writing to the church in Thessalonica, 1 Thessalonians 5, verses 1 through 5. And Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may be made blind." Then some of the Pharisees who were with him heard these words and said to him, "Are we blind also?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you say we see, therefore your sin remains." That's John chapter 9, verse 39 through 41. "For I have given to them the words which you have given me, and they have received them, and have known surely that I came forth from you, and they have believed that you sent me." That's John 17, verses 8. Jesus praying in Gethsemane before the crucifixion. So prophecy being lived out that way or acted out, but it doesn't just come out of the blue. There's another simpler one that precedes it, where right after Jesus is baptized, here in Matthew chapter 3, at the end of chapter 3, verse 13, Jesus came to John the Baptist, and he was baptized, which represents his death of his flesh, his death and his resurrection. So possibly something might happen afterward that signifies what might happen after his death and resurrection. And what happens is he is led into the wilderness by the Spirit to be tempted. He fast for 40 days and 40 nights. So, obviously, the Israelites wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and this is symbolic of that, and has this is a typology of them wandering, and Jesus fulfilling the righteousness that they failed at. And also, there are 40 jubilee periods in approximately a 2,000-year period. If it's every 49 years, then it comes to 1,993. If it's calculated by an even 50, then it's an even 2,000. There are 50 of those periods. I'm sorry, there are 40 50-year periods. So it's kind of interesting that after his death and resurrection, there's this something that might symbolize an approximately 2,000-year period, and then he has to deal with Satan. And this is symbolic of, I think, when at the end of Revelation, Satan is overcome and chained for 1,000 years. Jesus overcomes him here spiritually by not giving in to his temptation. So he wins this battle here, and it's like a typology of when he returns and wins the battle again, ultimately, and Satan is bound for 1,000 years. So I thought this is a good thing to cover, just to show that there are simple ones of these typologies or patterns that may indicate or allude to prophecy that happens even, before the larger one that I just covered with the prophecy and the miracles. So it's not that far-fetched. It's not that difficult to understand that, yes, there are simpler ones. That may be a more complicated one. That doesn't invalidate it, though, because it's more complicated. There are more of these through the New Testament and Scripture. So I hope you found this study interesting and that it gives you some things to consider. And if you are not a born-again Christian, or you're not sure, please watch or read the webpage. Either watch the video or read the webpage, Essential End Times Christianity, which I will leave a link to in the description. And until next time, God bless.